Welcome to Animal Attacks. Today, I'll be covering some of the most dangerous bear encounters, beginning with a stolen can of bear spray that became the center of a deadly night. It was September 9, 2016. Deep within the remote backcountry of Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana, dense conifer forests covered the ridgelines, while winding trails cut through rocky creek beds and miles of rugged, mountainous wilderness known to be prime grizzly habitat. The park draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, but its backcountry zones remain largely undeveloped, with narrow, unmarked spur trails that see far less traffic than the main scenic route. Rangers routinely posted warnings at trailheads about recent bear activity in the area, reminding hikers to store food properly and travel in groups where possible. Denny Ochoa, 25, worked part-time at a local bar and spent much of his free time looking for inexpensive ways to pass the time. His roommate, Colby Ventris, 26, had recently lost his job at a regional warehouse and was struggling to find new work. Neither man had significant wilderness experience, but they decided to spend a weekend camping in the mountains as a break from their routine. Their preparations were minimal, consisting mostly of basic camping supplies and a rough idea of where they intended to travel. After arriving in the park, Denny and Colby set up camp near an older couple who carried bear spray and followed strict food storage practices, hanging their supplies well away from their tents each night. The two friends dismissed the precautions as unnecessary, and the following day, while the couple was away collecting water, Denny took one of their spray canisters as a prank. Later, they continued deeper into the backcountry than planned and made camp after dark, leaving food scraps, cooking grease, wrappers, and unfinished snacks scattered near their tent instead of securing them in a bear-proof container. During the early hours of the morning, a grizzly bear moving through the drainage picked up the scent of the food and entered the campsite. The animal moved methodically through the site, tearing open containers and pawing through the scattered supplies, and the noise eventually woke both men. Waking up to noises outside your tent is already unsettling, but not knowing what's actually out there makes it worse. Colby reached for the stolen bear spray, but he had never used a canister before. Fumbling in the dark to find and release the unfamiliar safety clip, he lost his grip on the can and it fell into the dirt before he could aim or deploy it. I think this is the exact moment where panic started replacing preparation. The sudden movement and noise startled the bear. Instead of retreating with the food it had already found, it turned and charged directly at the campsite. Denny scrambled to his feet and was knocked backward into the stone fire ring by the force of the charge. The bear closed its jaws around his forearm and dragged him off balance, pulling him toward the edge of the clearing. Then he shouted for help as he tried to twist free of the bear's grip. Colby grabbed a flashlight and bolted into the darkness, intending to run for the trailhead and find help, but he caught his foot on a root in the dark and badly twisted his knee. The injury buckled his leg and slowed him to a crawl, forcing him to stop well short of the trailhead. Few of us know how we'd actually behave with an apex predator that close, but it left Danny completely alone within seconds. Left alone with the bear, Danny tried to shield his head and pull his arm free. It's hard to imagine how terrifying that moment must have been, trapped in a fight with almost no way to control it. Over the next several seconds, the bear bit down twice more, tearing deep gashes across his shoulder and forearm before releasing him, snatching up part of the abandoned food cache, and disappearing back into the tree line. The bites had torn through major blood vessels in his arm, and blood loss began almost immediately. Unable to stand, Danny was left lying near the fire ring, losing blood faster than his body could compensate. As daylight broke, a pair of hikers on a nearby trail heard cries coming from the drainage below and followed the sound to the campsite where they radioed park rangers. Rescue crews reached Denny and began treatment on site, but the wounds were too severe. He died during transport, having lost an unrecoverable volume of blood from the torn vessels in his arm. Investigators found the scene consistent with a food-conditioned grizzly drawn in by unsecured supplies. They also noted that the campers Campers had access to bear spray that went unused during the encounter, though they could not determine how much difference it would have made once the charge had already begun. Investigators concluded that the greater factors were the unsecured food, the close-range surprise encounter, and the pair's lack of preparation for grizzly country. Up next, we follow two cousins whose curiosity about something they found in the woods led them into an unexpected encounter. It was July 13, 2019. Along a remote stretch of rugged woodland in Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, dense forests of birch and conifer trees surrounded old logging routes that wound through miles of isolated wilderness far from the nearest settlement. The peninsula holds one of the highest densities of brown bears in the world, drawn in large part by the region's salmon runs, and local guides frequently caution travelers against carrying any fish or fish byproducts through the backcountry during spawning season. Marisol Laughlin, 24, worked as a veterinary assistant at an animal clinic in Spokane, Washington, and spent much of her free time exploring remote wilderness areas. Her cousin, Piper Duzak, 23, balanced classes at a community college with part-time work at a local service station. The two had traveled to Kamchatka as part of a planned outdoor adventure, hoping to photograph the region's volcanic landscapes and wildlife. Although they had experience with backcountry camping in North America, this was their first extended trip into Kamchatka's remote wilderness, and they packed lightly for what they expected would be a routine overnight excursion. Earlier that day, the cousins followed an overgrown logging spur beyond the main trail and discovered a black duffel bag hidden beneath a rocky overhang. Inside were tightly wrapped packages of salmon, likely left behind by illegal fishers operating in the area. The plastic wrapping on several packages had torn, allowing a strong odor to escape into the bag's lining. Believing someone had simply abandoned the supplies, the cousins pulled the bag out from under the overhang and carried it a short distance away from the logging route, setting it down beside the spot where they planned to camp, intending to report it to local authorities once they left the wilderness. Neither of them realized how far the smell had already soaked into the fabric, or how easily it could travel through the forest at night. As evening approached, they pitched their tent on a quiet ridge, with the bag left sitting just outside the entrance. During the night, a Kamchatka brown bear moving through the drainage below picked up the scent of salmon drifting from the campsite and began climbing toward it. The bear approached the tent directly, sniffing along the outer wall and pawing at the fabric as it tried to reach the source of the smell. When the cousins woke to the sound and shifted inside the tent, the sudden movement startled the bear at close range. The bear reacted by tearing at the tent wall, trying to force its way toward the bag. The confined space put both cousins within arm's reach of the animal almost instantly. Piper, sleeping closest to the entrance, was struck first as the bear pushed through the collapsing fabric, suffering deep bites to her shoulder and side. Marisol grabbed for a knife stored in their gear and tried to pull her cousin back, but there was little room to maneuver inside the collapsing tent. Once the bear had torn the bag free, it lost interest in the cousins and began dragging the salmon away from the site. Piper had suffered catastrophic injuries and was unable to move. Marisol, herself bleeding from bites to her arm and leg, tried to keep pressure on her cousin's wounds, but Piper died from blood loss before help could reach them. Knowing she needed to find help, Marisol began crawling away from the wrecked campsite, moving only a short distance before stopping to rest each time. Being found after hours alone in the wilderness would end up being the moment her chances of survival actually changed. She eventually made it back to the logging route the cousins had followed earlier that day, where forestry workers driving through the area found her several hours later and radioed for emergency assistance. I don't think people realize how exhausting it is just to keep moving after injuries like that. Rescue teams were dispatched into the forest and located the campsite. Piper was found deceased at the scene. Investigators determined her injuries were consistent with a close-range bear encounter and concluded that the salmon odor from the duffel bag, combined with ordinary food smells from the camper's own supplies, had likely drawn the bear directly to the tent. Following that, we look at two friends who followed a trail through the snow, unaware they were moving toward a hidden threat. It was October November 4th, 2014, deep in a remote section of Wyoming's Bridger-Teton National Forest, near the edge of known grizzly habitat, fresh snow covered the rugged landscape as narrow trails, frozen creek beds, and dense mountain forests stretched across the isolated backcountry. Early season snowfall in the region often coincides with grizzlies entering a period of intense feeding activity ahead of winter denning, during which bears aggressively defend food sources such as carcasses, and wildlife officials had issued seasonal advisories that year, encouraging hikers to carry protection and avoid approaching any carcass they came across. Holt Kasparian, 29, spent his summers maintaining ski equipment and his winters working around the slopes of a nearby mountain community, and most of his outdoor experience came from familiar areas close to town. His friend, Rennick Ogilvie, 28, worked at a local agricultural supply store and had spent years exploring the surrounding wilderness from accessible trails and roads. Knowing they would be hiking through known grizzly country, Rennick brought along a hunting rifle he kept for backcountry trips. Even so, neither man had formal training or much real experience dealing with dangerous wildlife encounters. After a recent snowfall, the two friends headed into the forest for a day of exploring. While following a creek bed, they came across a set of large tracks pressed into the snow. The fresh snowfall had softened the edges of the prints enough that the two assumed the tracks were several days old, and they continued on without changing course. I probably would have wondered how old those tracks were too, but snow can be incredibly deceptive. The tracks led them deeper into remote terrain, farther from their planned route as daylight began fading. Eventually, they came across a partially covered elk carcass tucked beneath a stand of trees. As they moved closer, Holt noticed dirt and broken branches piled over parts of the carcass in a way that suggested an animal had been caching it as a food source. Before either man could back away, a female grizzly feeding nearby broke from cover and charged toward them. The moment they found that carcass, I knew they had walked into one of the riskiest situations in grizzly country. Rennick, closer to the animal, was struck first. The impact knocked him to the ground, and the bear bit down on his shoulder and side before he could get back to his feet. Holt shouted and threw his backpack at the bear, and the sudden object caused it to hesitate and pull back for a moment. Man, the speed of that situation is what gets me. There was no time to step back and think. They were reacting second by second. The distraction gave Rennick just enough time to crawl away before the bear's attention shifted toward Holt. Holt dropped low and tried to shield his head and neck as the bear closed in. The bear bit and clawed at his arm and back for several seconds before it broke off the attack and returned to guarding the carcass. Both men were left bleeding heavily in the snow, unable to move quickly through the deep drifts. Rennick's injuries were life-threatening, and he grew increasingly unresponsive as blood loss set in. Holt, wounded himself, tried to pack the worst of Rennick's wounds and slow the bleeding, but neither man carried a satellite phone or radio, and they were miles from the trailhead. That's a difficult position to even imagine, trying to save someone while knowing you're running out of strength yourself. Holt tried dragging Rennick toward lower ground, but managed only a short distance before exhaustion and his own blood loss forced him to stop. With Rennick's rifle, Holt fired several rounds into the air, hoping the sound would carry. A hunter working a ridge nearly a mile away heard the shots and radioed other hunters in the area, who began searching toward the sound. Search teams eventually located the two men in the remote drainage. Rennick was found deceased at the scene. The combination of severe blood loss, freezing temperatures, and the delay in reaching help proved fatal. Holt was airlifted out and survived after emergency surgery. Investigators concluded the two men had unknowingly approached a carcass being actively guarded by the grizzly, and that mistaking the tracks for older prints had put them on a collision course with the animal. To me, this really shows how quickly a defensive encounter can unfold before anyone has time to think. Next, we follow a solo backpacker who searched for shelter during a storm and found himself in a place that wasn't empty. It was November 17th, 2018. Deep within India's Western Ghats, steady mountain rain moved through the remote wilderness as dense forests surrounded narrow trails, moss-covered ground, and isolated stretches of backcountry far from the nearest road. The region is home to a healthy population of sloth bears, animals generally regarded as reclusive but known to react with sudden, forceful aggression when startled at close range, particularly particularly around rest sites and dens. Seiji Adades, 34, worked in inventory at a local warehouse in Tacoma and lived a quiet, routine life. After a divorce 2 years earlier, he began taking occasional solo backpacking trips whenever he needed a break from everyday responsibilities, usually planning his own routes and keeping the details of his trips to himself. Although he had experience camping alone, he had limited experience handling unexpected wilderness emergencies. During one weekend trip, Seiji set out expecting a routine overnight excursion. The weather turned quickly, with steady, cold rain moving in and making the trail slower and more difficult than he had planned for. Falling well behind schedule and far from the campsite he had intended to reach, he began looking for any kind of shelter from the wind and rain. While working his way along a hillside, Seiji came across a rocky outcrop with a shallow, cave-like recess carved into the stone, offering decent cover from the weather. He climbed inside and settled in to wait out the rain. He didn't notice that the packed down dirt floor and the claw marks scored into the walls were signs the shelter had been used repeatedly by wildlife. The recess, as it turned out, was a regular resting spot for a sloth bear moving through that stretch of forest. Being trapped in a small space changes everything. There's no easy way for either side to simply back away. With the rain continuing to fall outside, Seiji stayed put through the evening, unaware of how often the shelter had been used before him. Later that night, the sloth bear returned to the recess and found Seiji already inside. The narrow entrance left almost no room for either of them to back away, and the bear, confronted with something unfamiliar at extremely close range, reacted defensively. The attack came suddenly. The bear lunged at the opening as Seiji tried to scramble past it toward the entrance, and the narrow space pinned him against the rock wall as the bear struck at his shoulder and arm. As he pushed himself toward the opening, the bear continued clawing and biting, tearing deep wounds across his upper body before he finally forced his way out. Sloth bears get a reputation for being shy and reclusive, but that falls apart in exactly this kind of confined, close-range scenario. After the struggle, the bear moved off into the forest, leaving Seiji injured just outside the recess. He collapsed a short distance away, his legs no longer able to support him, with his pack and phone lying just out of reach. That detail is hard to sit with, because something as small as a few extra feet suddenly became an impossible distance. Because Seiji hadn't arranged a check-in with anyone until later in his trip, no search began right away. Through the night, his injuries worsened as the cold rain continued to fall around him. After roughly a full day, a father and daughter hiking through the area heard calls for help and found Seiji near the outcrop. After that much time alone out there, simply being found must have been an overwhelming moment. They had to move further down the trail to get a strong enough signal before they could reach emergency services. Rescue crews were dispatched and a helicopter eventually reached the site. Seiji's injuries had left him unable to move to shelter or reach his supplies, and investigators believe the combination of blood loss, trauma, and prolonged exposure to the cold rain caused his death. Evidence at the scene indicated he had unknowingly taken shelter in a site regularly used by a sloth bear, and that the animal's return to its usual resting spot triggered the attack. It's hard not to think about how close his supplies were, yet how impossible they had become to reach. From there, we follow a man who entered the woods chasing an online claim, only to find himself facing something far more dangerous. It was May 29, 2021. Deep within Alaska's Kodiak Island wilderness, clear mountain streams cut through dense forests of spruce and alder as steep terrain, thick vegetation, and remote trails separated the area from nearby roads and communities. Kodiak bears, among the largest bear subspecies in the world, are especially common along the island's salmon streams during the spring and early summer months. And local wildlife agencies routinely remind residents that a bear cub sighted alone is almost always still under close watch from its mother nearby. Dresden Ull, 31, had struggled to find stable work after a small contracting business he depended on closed the previous winter. Living near a coastal community in Alaska, he was often on the lookout for ways to earn quick money. He came across a thread online describing a Kodiak bear cub reportedly seen wandering alone near a creek trail for several days. Commenters speculated it had been separated from its mother, and some suggested wildlife officials would want to know its exact location. That's the kind of claim that can catch someone's attention, especially when they're already looking for a way to make money. Dresden decided that finding and documenting the cub could be worth something, either to officials or by selling photos of it himself. Without verifying any of it or contacting local wildlife authorities, he set out alone with only basic supplies. Following the trail toward the creek, Dresden spotted a small Kodiak bear cub moving along the water's edge. Believing it was on its own, he moved in closer, focused on getting a clear photo of its location and unaware that its mother could be close by. The forest around the creek stayed quiet. Water moved over smooth stones and light filtered down through the canopy. But an adult female Kodiak bear was keeping watch over her cub from nearby cover. That's what changed everything. Dresden wasn't just near a cub, he was near a mother protecting it. Mother Kodiak bears can become highly defensive when they perceive a person closing in on their young, particularly at short range. As Dresden approached, the sow noticed him and broke from the brush, vocalizing loudly and advancing quickly in an attempt to drive him off. When he failed to put distance between them, she charged, slamming into him and knocking him backward into the rocky creek bed. Dresden tried to get up and put distance between himself and the bear, but the attack continued. The sow bit and clawed at him repeatedly while he was pinned near the water, tearing wounds into his shoulder, back, and scalp, and leaving deep gashes across both arms that made it difficult to move or defend himself. Despite the damage to his hands and arms, he managed to keep hold of his phone. After several moments, the sow broke off the attack and moved away with her cub trailing behind her, leaving Dresden injured beside the creek. Unable to climb the bank or make his way back through the forest on his own, he stayed where he had fallen. His phone, undamaged by the creek water, still had signal. Having that phone within reach was one of the few things still working in his favor during that moment. Dresden reached emergency services and gave what details he could about his location, though his injuries made it difficult to speak clearly. Rescue crews used the call to narrow down the area, but the remote terrain meant they needed extra time and off-road equipment to reach him. While he waited, ongoing blood loss steadily weakened him. By the time crews reached the creek with a stretcher team, Dresden was unresponsive, and he could not be revived despite efforts at the scene. Investigators later found no evidence that any organized search for an orphaned cub, official or otherwise, had ever existed. The claims had spread online without a verified source. Wildlife officials pointed to the case as an example of how dangerous it can be to approach a young bear in the wild, especially when a protective mother is likely nearby. For our last case, we look at another camping trip where a simple decision near a tent brought a bear closer than anyone expected. It was August 6, 2022, deep within the forests of Uttarakhand, India. Dense mountain woodlands surrounded isolated campsites and narrow trails where darkness settled quickly after sunset and help was often hours away. The region's forests are home to a stable population of Asiatic black bears, animals generally regarded as shy but known to react aggressively when startled at close range, particularly around food, and local trekking guides in the area often advise visitors to store all food in sealed containers away from sleeping areas. Bramwell Sikora, 27, worked overnight shifts, stocking shelves at a distribution center, a schedule that often kept him apart from friends and family. After taking time off from his routine, he traveled abroad and planned a short solo trek through the mountain forests. He wasn't an experienced backcountry traveler, but he had joined friends on simple camping trips before and believed he understood the basics of spending a night outside. This time, he set out alone into unfamiliar terrain and told only a couple of people back home about his plans. Bramwell picked a secluded spot surrounded by thick trees and pitched his tent for the night. He'd packed basic supplies along with some food for the trip, including jerky and trail mix. Rather than storing the food away from his sleeping area, he left it in the tent's outer vestibule simply because it was easier to reach. That kind of decision probably feels so small in the moment it's just putting food somewhere convenient and moving on. He camped plenty of times before without any wildlife trouble and didn't think twice about it. As night fell, the forest grew quiet, except for the occasional rustle of branches and the sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. Unknown to Bramwell, the smell of the food stored near his tent had already drawn the attention of an Asiatic black bear working its way through the area, slowly closing the distance as it followed the scent. A short distance away, another trekker camping in the area was recording a night vlog on his phone, panning across the tree line and narrating quietly when the footage picked up faint sounds of movement drifting from Bramwell's campsite. The recording, later reviewed by investigators, was never released publicly. Inside his tent, Bramwell began noticing sounds outside, footsteps in the soft ground, leaves shifting, something brushing against the tent fabric. Assuming a fellow trekker was pulling a prank on him, he grabbed his flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside, calling out for whoever he thought was there to knock it off. The moment his flashlight beams swept the clearing, it became clear the sounds hadn't come from a person at all. An Asiatic black bear was rooting through the food stashed beside his tent, and the sudden light and shouting startled it at close range. Before Bramwell could back away, the bear lunged and struck him, knocking him backward into the tent. The structure collapsed around him as he fell, leaving him tangled in the fabric with almost no room to move or fight back. I think the scariest part of this moment is how little space there was to work with. He wasn't in an open area where he could simply run. The bear clawed and bit at him through the collapsed tent for several seconds, tearing wounds into his arms, chest, and side before it broke off and retreated into the trees. Once the bear was gone, Bramwell managed to fight his way free of the collapsed tent. Badly injured and unable to move quickly, he crawled away from the site and called out for help. The nearby trekker, whose camera had picked up the earlier commotion, heard the calls, alerted others camping in the area, and contacted emergency services, though the difficult terrain delayed the response by hours. Local rescue teams and medical personnel eventually reached Bramwell and worked to transport him out of the forest for treatment. But the severity of his wounds, combined with the time he'd spent alone before help arrived, had already taken a serious toll. It's difficult reading about situations where help does arrive, but the injuries have already taken too much of a toll. Despite the medical team's effort to stabilize him, Bramwell died before treatment could reverse the damage. Investigators concluded the Asiatic black bear had entered the campsite because of the unsecured food and that the animal reacted defensively after being startled at close range rather than approaching with any predatory intent. The nearby trekker's footage was reviewed as part of the investigation, but was never made public. The case became another example of how a small decision about where to store food can turn a routine camping trip into a fatal wildlife encounter. Looking back across all 6 cases, what stands out isn't any single dramatic failure. It's how ordinary most of the decisions were. A stolen prop, a found object nobody wanted to leave behind, tracks that looked old enough to ignore, a dry spot that seemed like luck, an online rumor worth chasing, a bag of trail mix left a little too close.